Thank you very much, Jenny. Well, I propose to look back on more than a decade of research on the Makua in Western Madagascar. They are the descendants of captives who were deported from Southeast Africa to Madagascar during the 19th century. They were named in reference to the Makua, the most important sociolinguistic group in present-day North Mozambique. While not all the East African captives imported to Madagascar were Makua from Mozambique, this name was used to refer to all the slaves imported from East Africa to Madagascar, as well as their descendants born in the island. In Imerina, in the Central Highlands of Madagascar, they were called Masombika, in reference to the port of Moçambique, an important center of slave trafficking. The generic terms Mozambique or Makua were generally used in the 19th century to designate East African captives who were deported from Southeast Africa to both the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean. Madagascar was a hub of the trade of Mozambique in the Southwest Indian Ocean. The slave trade between Mozambique and Madagascar took on a massive character at a time when the slave trade was progressively made illegal. Because of the partly illegal nature of the traffic, it seems difficult to quantify the 19th century slave trade between Mozambique and Madagascar. Considerable figures have been put forward, which need to be revised downwards. However, I consider that a minimum of 350,000 East African captives were imported during the 19th century into Madagascar, and that between 10 and 20% of them were re-exported elsewhere. Here you can see on this map the articulation between the illegal slave trade routes in red, the industrial routes or routes des engagés in purple, and the internal trafficking routes in Madagascar in green. While a part of the East African captives was re-exported to the French neighboring islands as engagés, another part, the vast majority, was enslaved within the Malagasy societies. Under British pressure, the Kingdom of Madagascar took a series of legislative measures which led to the proclamation in June 1877 of the collective emancipation of the Masombika in the territories under the authority of Antananarivo. It has been estimated that between 100,000 and 150,000 Moçambiques were freed by the law of Antananarivo in 1877. The emancipation of the Masombika was a measure against the slave trade, taken with a view to the application of the treaties concluded with Great Britain, and did not represent at all a march towards the abolition of slavery in Madagascar. Slavery has remained a legal institution registered in the various codes of law of the Kingdom of Madagascar. At its peak, in the mid-19th century, the Kingdom of Madagascar, whose capital was Antananarivo, nominally controlled about 2/3 of the island. On the west coast, 6 garrison posts were erected, such as you can see in Murundava and in the northwest coast in Majanga. But a large part of the western coast, such as between Murundava and Majanga, remained independent and was under the authority of local Sakalav kings and queens. In this western region, such as around Mentirano, the illegal slave trade and the enslavement of the Makua continued at least until 18 1896, the year of the abolition of slavery in Madagascar, which became a French colony. It is estimated that at least 500,000 people, probably more, were freed by the abolition of 1896, while the total population of the Big Island was only about 2.5 million. It should be pointed out that the majority of the slaves in Madagascar were Malagasy. While the greatest density of the serval population was in the Central Highlands, in Imerina, slavery increased considerably during the second half of the 19th century in the Sakalav West, where the Makua were very numerous in some areas. The coastal area between Murundav and Majanga was the last bastion of the illegal slave trade in Madagascar and the framework of my fieldworks I led during the 2000s. In 2004, as a part of my master thesis a long time ago, I conducted surveys in the Makua village around Murundava. The majority of the Makua in Murundav located the arrival of their ancestors at the former great slaving port of Mentiran. So for the purpose of my PhD thesis, I aim to trace the Makua ancestors' trajectories from Murundav to northwards in direction of Mentiran. Thus, in 2008, while I was doing my PhD, during 6 months, I followed the coast between Murundav and Majanga, collecting Makua oral memories. I interviewed more than 100 Makua slave descendants and also descendants of masters. I collected 150 names of Makua ancestors deported from Mozambique to Madagascar. I reconstructed 60 Makua genealogy, and I collected vocabulary and songs in Makua language. The witnesses I interviewed during the 2000s were among the descendants of the last East African captives deported to Madagascar during the second part of the 19th century. Their grandparents, even sometimes their own parents, had been deported to Madagascar as captives. The majority of the ancestors of the Makua I interviewed came from the northern Mozambique area, where the Makua made up the majority of the population. In order to retrace the itineraries of the Makua ancestors from Mozambique to Madagascar, I relied on a cross-referencing of oral sources and archival written sources in 5 languages, including Makua's ex-slave life stories from Norwegian missionary sources. I also explored material sources less familiar to historians, such as tombs, which are important to understand the construction of ancestry by former slaves and the persistence of several practices in Madagascar. My aim was to reconstruct the process of deportation and enslavement of East African captives who became Makua in Madagascar. Our ancestors came beyond the seas. This is how most of the Makua oral tradition began. In general, the Makua descendants I interviewed recognized the involuntary nature of the migration of their ancestors. They said, our ancestors were stolen, they were lost when they arrived in Madagascar, or they were slaves on Devu in Malagasy. Kalamba and Mikal were 2 former Makua slaves who were freed in 1877 in Murundav and joined the Norwegian mission. Through their life stories, I collected in Norwegian missionary sources, we can retrace their several trajectories from the interior of North Mozambique to the west of Madagascar. Here you can see the trajectory of Kalamba in red and those of Mikal in purple. Born around 1853 in Makua country in northern Mozambique, Kalamba was captured as a child, enslaved locally, then deported from the interior to the coast, sold to slave dealers, then transported in a dhow across the sea to Mentiran. Then on the west coast of Madagascar, he had different masters. And finally, he was freed in Murundad in 1877, and he joined the Norwegian mission. Several major stages emerged from the Makua ancestors' first crossing. Makua oral tradition do not retain the stage of the first crossing at the interior of Africa. In the interior of Africa, for example, the first march to the coast that we find in the life story of Kalamba, but there are main stages in common, such as the capture, the sale, the deportation across the sea, arrival and sale in Madagascar, and several trajectories in the west. The Makua ancestors experienced early forms of slavery and dependency in their country of origin in present-day Mozambique, such as Kalamba. Others were kidnapped, sold, and fairly quickly deported to Madagascar, such as Mikal. Thus, the East African captives experienced different trajectories, but they shared the collective experience of the first crossing, which also appear as a founding episode in the Makua oral history. In his life story, Kalamba relates the horror of the sea crossing, the promiscuity, the terror in which the captives were held by the crew members who told them that the Malagasy would eat them. So some captives threw themselves over the board because they were so terrorized. The myth of cannibalism was widely spread through the slave trade routes in the Indian Ocean. Only 400 kilometers separate the coast of North Mozambique from the northwest coast of Madagascar, such as Mentiran port. Despite the short distance, the first crossing through the Mozambique Channel was terrible for captives. A fairly high rate of mortality, maybe around 10% at least. And especially in the context of the illegal slave trade, the condition of deportation deteriorates. But even during the Middle Passage, the East African captives carried out strategies of resistance, in particular by creating links between them, which have been reinterpreted in terms of kinship. Indeed, the Makua transmit the memory of brothers and sisters who had been transported in the same dhow to Madagascar. And still in the 2000s, the marriage alliance between the descendants of this brother and sister was sanctioned by the taboo of incest, since they were considered to be relatives. Thus, preserving the memory of the Makua ancestors' first crossing served to build kinship between the Makua in Madagascar. Depending on where and when they were introduced in Western Madagascar, the Makua have experienced different legal status and social conditions. Slave, engagé, indenture, or freed slave, the Makua experienced different forms of dependency. Different types of Makua establishment can be distinguished in the West. The slaves were found almost everywhere in the West Coast. The indentured laborers were numerous in the French colony of Nosy, as you can see in the north, while freed Makua or Moçambique were established next to the garrison post as Majanga or Murundav, where they were freed in 1877. Other Makua groups experienced progressive emancipation in the Sakalav society, and they form a kind of group of dependents under the authority of the local Sakalav kings and queens. So by moving from one legal territory to another, the Makua have attempted to change their status or improve their condition. In 19th century, flight movement represent a massive phenomenon, perhaps the first form of resistance by slaves in Madagascar. The Makua engagés from Nosy were fleeing to the land of Madagascar and vice versa. Makua slaves run away from Sakalav independent areas, such as around Mentiran, to the main garrison posts, such as Murundav. The 1877 royal decree did not provide financial compensations for the master of Masombika, so that many of them left the surroundings of the garrison post to move towards independent regions of the West and thus keep their slaves. So, for example, there were slave masters who were fleeing from Majanga in the direction of Bali, in the west direction of Bali, Sualal, in direction of independent Western region. Slavery in Western Sakalav has considerably developed during the 19th century. There was a wide variety of servile function in the West. The Makua slaves were servants, craftsmen, cookers, porters, sailors, farmers, traders, etc. Unlike the Central Highlands men's society, slaves in the Sakalav West country were also made soldiers or concubines of kings or rich merchants. Here you can see the Makua concubines of Halidi. Halidi was a very important Sakalav chief and slave dealer in Mentiran at the end of the 19th century, and he owned a lot of Makua slaves, mostly farmers, but also concubines and soldiers. While the Sakalav aristocracy was among the main owners of slaves and land, however, slave ownership tended to become widespread among the different strata of the Sakalav society. It was not only my father who had slaves, but almost everyone had Makua, say the Sakalav inhabitant of Mentiran. Any Sakalav freeman was supposed to have a slave, otherwise he would be considered equally with the slaves. It was their belief that one was really free by owning another human being, wrote the Pastor Rosbeck in the 1880s. The wealth of a Sakalav was measured by head of cattle and number of slaves he owned. While the Sakalav preferred pastoral activities, the Makua dependents were overwhelmingly farmers. Working the land was gradually associated with servile labor in the West. There were plantations of rice, corn, sorghum, bananas that grew thousands of Makua slaves. You could walk during 2 days without finding an inch of land uncultivated, and also without meeting a free man, wrote in 1891 Douliot, a French traveler, while crossing the region around Mentirano. And here is Makua farmer establishment in the same region of Mentirano. In this region, the Makua made up almost the entire serval population. Over the generations, they form a kind of dependency group, a group of dependents under the authority of the local Sakalav kings and queens, for whom the Makua paid part of their harvest. But there are other situations. In Murundav, the Makua were freed in 1877. They found villages where they formed almost the entire population. Here you can see the picture of the village of Bemukidzi, formerly named Murimabe. Murimabe means the big Murima or the big Africa. So, and this village has been found by Makua ex-slaves in the 1880s. Here is another picture of a Makua village of Murundava named Murimakel, the little Murima, where I lived. In general, there were many Tana Makua or Makua village quarter found by former Makua slaves throughout Western Madagascar and even in other parts of the island, such as on the east coast of Madagascar. Between the 1880s and the 1900s, Makua from Murundav, some of whom have joined the Norwegian mission, led strategies of return to their country of origin. They located in the hinterland of northern Mozambique in Makua country. They organized themselves to return to their native country by collecting money, even by building dhows or boats themselves, by soliciting different authorities. However, neither the government of Antananarivo or later the French colonial authorities accede to their request. The issue was obviously to control this former servile forced labor. The Makua were thus forced to stay and onshore themselves in the land of Madagascar. In Madagascar, the most important concept to define a social identity is the ancestral land, Taninjasana, where the ancestors are located and buried. Whoever cannot refer to an ancestral land is a dependent, symbolically a slave. In Sakalav society, slaves were considered to have no ancestors. Nyandevu Tsimbaraza, the slaves are not ancestors. Slaves had no family tombs. They were buried with their masters. Therefore, they had no territorial roots, and they did not have zebu or oxen, which were necessary for the accomplishment of lineage rites. So during the colonial period, through agricultural work, the Makua gradually became richer. The Makua of Murundav became richer and were able to buy zebu, sometimes even own herds of zebu, and thus meet interlineage obligations. The construction of tombs appeared to be a central element to the construction in kinship groups and access to ancestry. Here is a picture of a Christian Makua family tombs in Murundava. At the same time, in Sualal, I was able to visit the tomb of a family of masters. The Makua slaves were buried at the feet of the masters' tombs, which were built in stone, while simple stone indicated the location of the slaves' grave. The slaves were buried with their heads facing west, the direction of the profane, and impure, while their masters were facing east, the direction of the sacred. These family tombs in Sualal I visit were not built in the 19th century, but they date from the 20th century, the post-abolition era. Thus, long after the abolition, former Makua slaves and their descendants continued to be buried at the feet of the masters in certain regions of the West. I have to underline that this is very violent practices in Madagascar. In the post-abolitionist era, such several practices and relationship of dependency were perpetuated between the descendant of slaves and the descendant of master. For example, in the West Coast, descendants of royal Makua slaves continued to perform former several funerary tasks, in particular related to the maintenance of royal tombs. Women descendant from Makua slaves continue to perform domestic tasks in the house of masters, as for example in Sualal, still in the 2000s. And I even met in some West region master who present me their slaves, their Makua slaves. So, the Makua in Madagascar appear to be a very heterogeneous group experiencing various situations. However, they shared a common language and culture. All the Makua in Madagascar spoke the same language, a dialect variant of the Makua spoken in North Mozambique. In the Makua village of Ansakameruak, near Murundav, the Makua was a vehicular language since the 1940s. In this village, I was able to consult a Makua vocabulary notebook translated into Malagasy. Writings notebooks in Makua have been widely circulated since the end of the 19th century among the Makua village of Murundav. There is a great diversity of Makua cultural practices in the West: dances, songs, drums, culinary specialty, food specialty, oral literature. Here is a picture of Makua drummers in 1922 in northwest Madagascar. During the colonial period, the colonial race policy, la politique des races coloniales, paradoxically favored the maintenance of Makua cultural practices and their group specificity, but by folklorizing this custom and keeping them also in a form of marginality. Here is a vestige of the Makua material culture, a round stone used in the making of manure flour. The cassava flour was the main staple food of the Makua slaves and continued to be cooked by their descendants to make traditional Makua dishes. This drink, Muzizima, was distributed during the Makua commemoration day in the village of Bemukids in Murundava. Maybe I could talk about this even in the discussion. So this alcohol is made from fermented rice and reduced to flour. I also collected Makua songs, especially religious hymns to the glory of God, composed in Makua language by Christian Makua from Murundava. Here is a song collected from Imerina, the woman on the left. She was born in 1921 in the Makua village, in a Makua village of Murundav. And she sang the glory of God Muluku in Makua language. The gradual disappearance of Makua born in Africa during the 20th century has been accompanied by the disappearance of Makua cultural practices in Madagascar. With the independence of Madagascar in 1960, the Makua faced other social integration challenge, the challenge to integrate the nation. And during the presidency of Ratsirak since the 1970s, with a socialist policy, paradoxically, it has encouraged the abandonment of certain cultural specificities, such as the Makua language. The Makua appear to be the only ex-slave group in Madagascar who were fully recognized as an ethnicity or an extended kinship group, which means having a territorial anchorage, having ancestors and culture in common, historical traditions and collective memories. The Makua refer to foreign ancestors. But if they were captured and deported to Madagascar, this also suggests that they were born free in their ancestral homeland. By remembering their ancestors' trajectories, the Makua can trace their ancestry back to a distant free origin. And this is the great difference between the descendants of Makua slaves and the descendants of Malagasy slaves in Madagascar, who do not have external resources to reinvent their social identity. The Makua in the West have also experienced a greater social mobility than in other regions of Madagascar. In the Marin society of the Highlands, matrimonial unions between statutory groups were greatly discredited, if not prohibited. However, in Western Sakala society, if it was badly perceived to marry a Makua slave, such unions were not prohibited. We even find Makua ancestors in some royal Sakala families, as the children of Makua concubines inherited their father's status. Also, the inter-alliances mainly concerned Sakala men and Makua women. By getting rich and acquiring zebu, some Makua men were able to marry Sakala women. Through matrimonial alliances strategies, Makua were able to erase their serval and foreign origins. They became Sakala. In West Madagascar, the vast majority of Makua descendants choose to change their name and become Sakalav. They are said to have turned their back on their ancestors. In the 2000s, there were only a few old Makua who continued to transmit the memory of their grandparents born in Africa. The Makua elder named Ruruni had his four grandparents born in Mozambique and sold as slaves in Madagascar. Born in 1918 in Mentiran, Ruruni had a remarkable knowledge of the Makua language, culture, oral history. He lamented being the last Makua of his family. All of my descendants want to run away from our ancestors. They no longer want to say they are Makua. I am the last, and this name will disappear with me, said Ruruni. The name of the Makua continues to be used in Madagascar as an adjective to designate a person considered very dark-skinned, strong, robust person, or as a synonym of African or a synonym of slaves. In an insular context, the reference to foreignness is not excluded by claims to autochthony, as all the Malagasy have ancestors from overseas. But in the case of the Makua, this foreignness refers to the condition of their ancestors' migration, which, apart from its recent character, is intimately linked to the slave trade and slavery. The Makua were able to negotiate a group identity that was specific, but which nevertheless remained marginal. Finally, the stigmatization of the Makua revealed the limit of their social integration in Sakala country. During the 2000s, when the last witnesses relating to Makua ancestors gradually disappeared, young musicians have reappropriated themselves the Makua identity and have positivate this marginal identity in Madagascar. Makua hip-hop groups were formed in the 2000s. Also, the rappers of this group were not themselves linked to Makua ancestors at all, or of any serval origin. On the contrary, many rappers of Makua groups who have access to technology and internet have rather wealthy social backgrounds. The Makua identity can be claimed symbolically in order to relate to Africa, or to affirm Madagascar belonging to Africa, or to claim a so-called Afro-Malagasy identity. Thank you.